The gilded mirrors of Versailles reflected a queen's final descent into nightmare. October 1793. The woman who once commanded armies of servants with the flutter of a jeweled fan now sat shivering in a cell barely 8 feet wide, her once pristine hands now stained with grime and desperation. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who had danced through the most opulent court in Europe, was about to face 76 days of systematic humiliation designed to break not just her body but her very spirit. What happened to Marie Antoinette in those final months before her appointment with the guillotine wasn't merely imprisonment. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare, a deliberate dismantling of everything that had once made her a symbol of royal power. The Revolutionary Tribunal didn't just want her dead, they wanted her destroyed, transformed from queen to beggar, from symbol of divine authority to a broken woman pleading for mercy that would never come. Today, we strip away the romanticized portraits and Hollywood dramatizations to examine the brutal reality of Marie Antoinette's final ordeal. The truth is far more sinister than most people realize, a story of calculated cruelty that reveals the darkest impulses of revolutionary justice. To understand the full horror of what awaited Marie Antoinette, we must first grasp the world that had turned against her with such venomous intensity. By 1793, France had erupted into a maelstrom of revolutionary fervor that consumed everything in its path. The elegant salons and perfumed gardens of the old regime had given way to blood-soaked streets and the constant thunder of angry crowds demanding retribution. Marie Antoinette had become the perfect scapegoat for France's accumulated rage. Born an Austrian archduchess, she had never truly been accepted by the French people, who viewed her as a foreign interloper bleeding their nation dry. Her reputation for extravagance, whether deserved or not, had crystallized into a symbol of aristocratic excess in the minds of starving peasants. The woman they called l'Autrichienne, the Austrian, was now seen as the embodiment of everything wrong with the monarchy. But hatred alone doesn't explain what happened to her. The revolutionary government understood that Marie Antoinette's execution would carry enormous symbolic weight across Europe. Kings and queens would be watching, measuring the resolve of the new French Republic. Her death had to send a message that would echo through every palace on the continent, that the age of divine right was ending, and no crown, however ancient, could protect its wearer from the people's justice. The transformation began with her arrest on August 10, 1792, when revolutionary forces stormed the Tuileries Palace. The queen, who had once required an hour merely to dress each morning, assisted by a carefully choreographed ballet of ladies-in-waiting, was now roughly seized by men who showed no reverence for her royal person. Contemporary accounts describe how she was handled without ceremony, her elaborate coiffure disheveled, her silk gowns torn in the struggle. Initially confined with her family in the Temple Tower, Marie Antoinette experienced her first taste of the systematic humiliation that would define her remaining months. The royal apartments, though still relatively comfortable, were under constant surveillance. Guards peered through keyholes, monitored conversations, and treated the former queen with deliberate disrespect. Every privacy she had once taken for granted was stripped away, every dignity methodically eroded. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Marie Antoinette had lived her entire adult life surrounded by elaborate protocol that reinforced her elevated status. From the moment she woke until she retired, every interaction had acknowledged her royal rank. Now, guards addressed her as Citizen Capet, deliberately using the family's original surname to deny her any claim to royal title. This wasn't merely disrespect, it was an attempt to rewrite her very identity. But this was only the beginning. On August 1, 1793, Marie Antoinette was separated from her children and husband, torn away from the last human connections that provided her with emotional stability. The separation was deliberately cruel, conducted in the early hours of the morning to maximize the shock and disorientation. Witnesses reported her desperate attempts to embrace her children one final time, only to be physically restrained by guards who showed no mercy for a mother's anguish. Her new prison was the Conciergerie, a medieval fortress on the Ile de la Cité that had been converted into a holding facility for those awaiting trial. The contrast with her former life could not have been more stark. The woman who had slept in beds draped with cloth of gold now found herself in a damp cell with walls that wept moisture and a straw mattress that reeked of previous occupants. The cell itself was a masterpiece of calculated degradation. Measuring barely 8 feet by 6 feet, it contained only the most basic furnishings: a wooden table, a single chair, and that wretched straw bed. A small window, barred and set high in the wall, provided the only natural light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to mock her former existence in the sun-drenched halls of Versailles. But the physical discomfort was merely the foundation for a more sophisticated form of torture. The conciergerie operated under a regime designed to break the spirits of its prisoners through constant surveillance and deliberate unpredictability. Guards could enter Marie Antoinette's cell at any hour, day or night, ostensibly for security checks, but actually to prevent her from ever feeling safe or settled. Sleep became a luxury she could rarely afford. The sounds of the prison, screaming from other cells, the heavy footsteps of guards, the constant din of revolutionary songs echoing through the corridors, created an environment where rest was nearly impossible. When exhaustion finally overcame her terror, she would be jolted awake by guards conducting inspections, or by the arrival of new prisoners whose cries of despair pierced the stone walls. The food provided was deliberately meager and often spoiled, a far cry from the elaborate meals that had once graced her table. Thin gruel, stale bread, and occasionally a piece of rancid meat comprised her daily sustenance. The guards took particular pleasure in describing the lavish banquets being held by revolutionary leaders while she struggled with these scraps, a psychological technique designed to emphasize her fall from grace. Personal hygiene, once an elaborate daily ritual involving perfumed baths and the finest soaps, became nearly impossible. She was provided with a single bucket of cold water each day and no privacy in which to use it. The guards deliberately lingered during these moments, turning basic human needs into opportunities for humiliation. Her once pristine appearance began to deteriorate rapidly, her hair becoming lank and unwashed, her skin growing pale and marked by the dirt of her surroundings. The revolutionary authorities understood that breaking Marie Antoinette's dignity was as important as breaking her body. They systematically stripped away every element of the refined existence she had known, forcing her to confront her own mortality while simultaneously destroying her sense of self-worth. The goal wasn't simply to imprison her, it was to demonstrate that royalty itself was a hollow pretense that could be dissolved by the people's will. This calculated destruction of her identity extended to her clothing, once a source of immense pride and political significance. The elaborate gowns that had required teams of seamstresses and cost more than most French peasants earned in a lifetime were replaced by rough, ill-fitting prison garb. The symbolic power of this transformation cannot be overstated. The woman whose fashion choices had once influenced courts across Europe now wore the same coarse fabric as common criminals. As autumn deepened into winter, the true extent of the Revolutionary Tribunal's plan began to emerge. Marie Antoinette's imprisonment wasn't merely preparation for her trial, it was the trial itself, a public demonstration of how thoroughly the old order could be humiliated and broken. The revolutionary authorities had learned from the execution of Louis XVI earlier that year. His relatively dignified bearing on the scaffold had troubled them, creating an uncomfortable reminder that royal blood could face death with aristocratic composure. They were determined that Marie Antoinette would provide no such inspiration to the remaining monarchies of Europe. Her destruction had to be complete, visible, and utterly convincing. The interrogations began in earnest during September, conducted by Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, the chief prosecutor whose very name had become synonymous with revolutionary justice. These weren't mere legal proceedings, they were theatrical performances designed to humiliate the former queen before an audience of carefully selected witnesses. Fouquier-Tinville understood that every detail would be reported across France and beyond, shaping public perception of both Marie Antoinette and the revolutionary cause itself. The questioning sessions took place in a cramped chamber lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Marie Antoinette was forced to stand for hours while prosecutors hurled accusations at her with increasing vehemence. They accused her of treason, of secret correspondence with Austria, of corrupting the king, of squandering France's treasury on personal luxuries while children starved in the streets. Each session was carefully choreographed to maximize her humiliation. She was denied legal counsel for the first several weeks, forced to defend herself against trained lawyers who twisted her words and exploited every moment of confusion or exhaustion. When she struggled to remember specific dates or details from years past, they portrayed this as evidence of deception rather than the natural result of trauma and sleep deprivation. The prosecutors took particular pleasure in reading aloud her private correspondence, letters written to her mother and siblings that had been intercepted by revolutionary agents. These intimate communications, never intended for public consumption, were dissected phrase by phrase to reveal supposed evidence of treasonous intent. The woman who had once commanded absolute privacy now found her most personal thoughts exposed to hostile scrutiny. But perhaps most devastating were the attacks on her character as a mother and wife. Revolutionary propaganda had painted her as a sexual deviant who had corrupted the royal court with Austrian decadence. Now, in the confines of the interrogation chamber, these slanders were presented as established fact. She was accused of inappropriate relationships with court favorites, of teaching her children to despise France, of emasculating her husband through foreign influence. Marie Antoinette's responses to these accusations revealed both her growing desperation and her stubborn refusal to completely surrender her dignity. Contemporary transcripts show her attempting to maintain formal language and proper deportment even as her physical condition deteriorated. She continued to refer to Louis XVI as the king rather than citizen Capet, a small act of defiance that enraged her interrogators and led to increasingly harsh treatment. The guards assigned to her cell were selected specifically for their ability to maintain constant psychological pressure. They were instructed to show no deference whatsoever to her former rank, addressing her with deliberate crudeness and making crude jokes about her past. Some had lost family members during the early stages of the revolution and harbored personal hatred for the monarchy. Their presence created an atmosphere of barely contained violence that kept her in a state of perpetual fear. Sleep deprivation became one of their most effective weapons. The guards would enter her cell multiple times each night, claiming to check for escape attempts or hidden messages. They would overturn her meager possessions, examine every inch of the small space, and sometimes simply stand watching her for long minutes before departing. The randomness of these intrusions made it impossible for her to establish any routine or find moments of genuine rest. The impact on her physical appearance became increasingly dramatic. Witnesses who had known her at Versailles reported being shocked by her transformation when they glimpsed her during transport to and from interrogation sessions. Her once lustrous hair had begun falling out in clumps, whether from stress, malnutrition, or the harsh soap provided for washing. Her complexion, once celebrated throughout Europe for its porcelain perfection, had become sallow and marked by dark circles beneath her eyes. Her hands, which had once been objects of particular pride, soft, white, and decorated with magnificent rings, now showed the effects of her harsh treatment. The nails were broken and dirty, the skin roughened by constant contact with the coarse materials of her cell. These details were carefully noted by her interrogators, who understood that every sign of her degradation served their larger purpose of demonstrating the powerlessness of the old regime. The Revolutionary Tribunal also employed more subtle forms of psychological torture. They would bring her false news about her children, claiming that her son Louis Charles had publicly denounced her as a traitor to France. They described in graphic detail the executions of other nobles, particularly those who had been part of her inner circle at court. These reports served the dual purpose of isolating her emotionally while creating anticipation of her own inevitable fate. Letters from sympathizers were intercepted and used as evidence against her, turning even gestures of compassion into weapons for the prosecution. Anyone who expressed pity for her situation was portrayed as an enemy of the Republic, creating a climate where showing mercy became synonymous with treason. This systematic isolation ensured that she faced her ordeal without hope of rescue or even comfort from former friends. The medical treatment she received was deliberately inadequate, designed to keep her alive for trial while allowing her condition to deteriorate visibly. When she complained of illness, the prison doctor would provide minimal care while documenting her symptoms for the prosecution. Her menstrual bleeding had become irregular and painful, but requests for appropriate medical attention were denied as unnecessary luxuries inappropriate for a prisoner of the state. By October, the full scope of the revolutionary plan had become clear. Marie Antoinette's trial would be the culmination of months of systematic destruction, presenting to the world not a defiant queen, but a broken woman whose suffering validated the righteousness of the revolutionary cause. Every aspect of her treatment had been calculated to ensure that when she finally faced the tribunal, she would appear as a pitiful figure deserving of contempt rather than martyrdom. The transformation was nearly complete, but the most devastating revelations were yet to come. The woman who mounted the scaffold on October 16, 1793, bore little resemblance to the radiant queen who had once dazzled European courts. The Revolutionary Tribunal had achieved their goal with surgical precision. They had not merely destroyed Marie Antoinette's body, but had systematically dismantled the very idea of royal dignity itself. Her final journey to the guillotine was the culmination of 76 days of calculated cruelty designed to prove that crowns offered no protection against the people's wrath. What we've witnessed in Marie Antoinette's final ordeal reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature and the exercise of power. The crowds that jeered at her broken form were not monsters, but ordinary citizens who had been conditioned to see her suffering as justice. The guards who tormented her were following orders in a system that had normalized extreme cruelty as political necessity. The prosecutors who orchestrated her humiliation were convinced they were serving a righteous cause. Marie Antoinette's story serves as a chilling reminder that civilization's veneer is thinner than we might believe, and that the transformation from victim to symbol can happen with terrifying speed. Her suffering became a cautionary tale that echoed through history, demonstrating that in times of revolutionary fervor, mercy becomes treason, and human dignity becomes a luxury that few can afford to defend.